Today, it is my honor to introduce our guests. Dr. J. Patrick Mullins, Associate Professor of History and Public History Director at Marquette University. Hi, Patrick. Dr. Eileen Cheng, Associate Professor of History at Sarah Lawrence College. Hi, Eileen. And SUZANNE Buchanan, Executive Director of the Shirley-Eustis House right here in Boston in Roxbury. Hi, Susie. Thank you all for joining us. I am so honored and delighted to have you all here. I want to get us started with a background on the Loyalists. Can you give us a brief background on the people who identified as Loyalists, what their lives looked like leading up to and during the Revolution, and what happened to them after the war? Patrick, do you want to start us off on this?
Sure, and Gina, thanks for having us. So I see there as being kind of three basic categories of Loyalists. There are people who really just wanted to remain neutral in the war, but because they were trading in violation of non-importation or selling livestock to the British, they were tarred as loyal. A lot of the Native Americans wanted to stay out of the war, but they got sucked into it. There were some religious groups like Quakers and Mennonites who were opposed to war in principle and were often seen as siding with the British. There were also Loyalists who, some of them who believed in Tory principles of obeying the king no matter what, and that resistance to lawful authority was a Christian sin. And there was these were like high church Anglican clergy, but that was a small group. I think most Loyalists were people who held the same Whig principles of constitutional liberty as the Patriots did. They just thought that that the violence of the Sons of Liberty, the oppressiveness of non-importation was a greater threat to constitutional liberty than Crown and Parliament. And I guess we'll see throughout our discussion today what happens to these folks. They have very different destinies.
Susie, do you have anything to add to that you'd like to share?
Just one of the, when you sort of come back 10,000 feet and you look at the percentages, a lot of Loyalists who didn't have the wherewithal to kind of take a stand, as Patrick said, just sort of remained neutral. They might have had an opinion, but they didn't say anything because it meant risking too much. And that's sort of the middling and lower classes of folks who were really more concerned about just making a living.
I think let's go a little deeper with this, and I want to pass this one to Eileen to start. Loyalists have a wide range of backgrounds, motivations, and expressions of sympathy for Great Britain. What were their motivations for harboring pro-British sentiment, and what were the consequences of that in their daily lives? Was it just as simple as we're British?
Well, I mean, I think it's true that the Loyalists were pro-British, but I think, and this ties in a little bit to what Patrick was saying about how the Loyalists shared a lot of the same principles as the revolutionaries. That I think to say, oh, the Loyalists were pro-British and the revolutionaries were pro-American doesn't really capture the complexities of the loyalties back then. That on the one hand, the revolutionaries were very much pro-British themselves until 1775, 1776. They were protesting all these British taxes, but it was on the basis that they thought of themselves as British citizens, and they thought they weren't being treated as equal British citizens. And then on the other side, the Loyalists, while they were loyal to Britain, they also saw themselves as true Americans. But what they believed, and I think this is what really separates them in the end from the revolutionaries, is that when it comes time for war and independence, that whatever problems they had with British policies, they thought war would be just too destructive, that they didn't think they could win against the British, or even if they did and became independent, that France or Spain would just take over. And they felt that Americans were better off under British rule trying to achieve reform within the system than trying to survive outside that system.
We just got a really great question in the chat right off the bat. Thank you, Michael, for this one. Were Loyalists called Loyalists at the time, or is that a more modern term? We should definitely talk about this, in terms of our vocabulary as we keep going. What did people refer to Loyalists as in the era?
I think it depended on who you were. I think for the revolutionaries, they called the Loyalists Tories and kind of to stigmatize them and make it seem like, oh, they were just pro-monarchy. I think the Loyalists do start adopting the term Loyalist for themselves, I think sometime starting around 1774. So yeah, I think from their perspective, they did see themselves as Loyalists, but they were not seen as that by the revolutionaries.
That's really interesting. Does anybody else want to jump in on that kind of background about the Loyalists? Patrick, absolutely.
Yeah, I just wanted to echo Eileen here. One of the Massachusetts Loyalists, Daniel Leonard, wrote in attacking John Adams, said, well, you guys call us Tories. Well, if a Tory is someone who believes that the majority shouldn't be allowed to do whatever they want to, then call me a Tory, right? So he kind of owned the word. I just want to concur that for me, the problem is less explaining why some Americans remain loyal to Britain, but why some Americans didn't, right? Because through the 1760s, 1770s, the American colonists were enormously proud of being British. And this is true of not just those who were ethnically, English or Scottish. They resisted parliamentary acts that they saw as unconstitutional in the British Constitution, right? And even when New England militia took up arms in 1775, they saw themselves as, they took inspiration from the memory of the English Civil War and saw themselves as being like their British forebears standing up against Charles I. The American Revolution initially was kind of, they saw it as the Patriots saw it as a continuation of that revolutionary tradition.
Patrick, let's kind of stay on this topic with you a little bit more about the tragedy of the Loyalists, if you will. Thomas Hutchinson, great example of a really maligned figure, right? After being forced to evacuate, he spent the rest of his life in England, hoping to come home to America, but unable to do so. So this is a really interesting tragedy. People born in America, true early American citizens, right, who had feelings about the British Constitution and their own government, were forced to flee because of their political affiliation. So what happened to those people? Did they become refugees? Where were expat communities created? Can you feel that for us a little bit, Patrick?
Sure. A lot of Loyalists did become refugees. This is particularly true in New England, where they were very much outnumbered, unlike, say, in parts of New York or the South. When the British evacuated Boston, they took about 3,000 Loyalists with them. These folks went to New England. Some of them stayed in Nova Scotia. Some of them stayed in Nova Scotia. Other Loyalists, particularly from New York, ultimately settled in Ontario. A lot of these New England refugees relocated to London and became a little expat community there. And then some Loyalists were enslaved people who were liberated by the British Army and found new lives in Canada. And some of those folks eventually would create a colony of free people in West Africa, called Sierra Leone. And then there were some Loyalists who did return to the colonies, to the states at this point, and in some cases successfully sued to regain confiscated property. Alexander Hamilton actually represented a lot of these people in New York, and in many cases they were reassimilated into American society. This was less true in New England than in New York and the South, where there was larger numbers of Loyalists to begin with, but not all of them had the same kind of tragic as Hutchinson.
Thanks, Patrick. Susie, do you want to add to that?
Well, actually, so I thought that was really interesting that Alexander Hamilton worked on behalf of many of the ones who were coming back. And there's a wonderful story about John Adams reuniting with his friend Jonathan Seward, and their friendship had really broken up over the Revolutionary War. And then when it was over, they saw each other and just gave each other a big hug at one point. I can't remember now whether this was while Adams was in the UK or whether it was back on home ground, but there were these bonds of friendship and love and family that sometimes just were only temporarily broken by the revolution.
It is emotional when you start to think about it, really. Talking also about, that tension, the tension of bonds. I want to get into the tension between the bond of breaking preservation and erasure, and that that tension right there. And I want to start off with Eileen for this one, to kind of address the tension between the preservation and erasure of the Loyalists in American history. How have Loyalist writers and historians from the era been perceived from their time of writing to today? Has our perception of these storytellers changed over time? Does lifting Loyalist stories give a broader perspective of America's biography?
Well, yeah, I think there's been a lot of change. And I think in terms of how modern scholars have seen them, I think modern scholars, have kind of portrayed these Loyalist and writers and historians as almost double losers, in a sense of both losing in the sense of just being defeated in the revolution, and also losing in the struggle over historical memory, in the sense that they were forgotten and also failed to produce a powerful counter narrative that could compete with the patriotic narratives that were being produced by the revolutionaries. And I think that is true to some extent, but what's actually interesting is if you go back to the time of the revolution itself and the years immediately afterwards, and you look at kind of American nationalist writers who were very pro-revolutionary, who were trying to promote a sense of nationalism, they were actually very ambivalent about these Loyalist historians. On the one hand, they were disparaging of these Loyalist historians and said, oh, they're prejudiced, they're pro-British. On the other hand, these nationalist writers are plagiarizing and copying from these Loyalist historians for their own histories. And what they do is they copy them, but in a selective way, and then twist these Loyalist histories to use them to justify the revolution and promote a sense of American nationalism and a sense of American exceptionalism. So I think the reason why it is important to learn more about these Loyalist historians is, in many ways, they play an important role in shaping this narrative of American exceptionalism that I think we still have with us today.
Do you feel that, and this is just jumping off one of our prepped questions here, do you feel that today the general vibe in the historical community is more empathy towards Loyalist historians than we've previously given in previous generations?
Definitely. I mean, I think that's been one major change. I think that, I think that for a long time, the Loyalists have just been kind of forgotten and vilified. And I think starting in the late 20th century, there was starting to be some interest by modern historians in them. And I think in the last 10 to 20 years, there's been really a revival and a kind of resurgence of interest in the Loyalists amongst historians. I'm not sure that that's reached to the larger public, though.
Yeah. I mean, I will say, I am not a historian, and learning about this was fascinating to me, just the change of perception of this. So if I am representative of the general public, it's very, very interesting. I wanna send this off to Susie and Patrick as well. How do you feel that the historical memory of the Loyalists either helped create a sense of American nationalism, a sense of exceptionalism? What are your thoughts on that?
I agree with Eileen that Loyalism played a role in defining a sense of American exceptionalism. I think that precisely because the American colonists, American revolutionaries were so culturally British, they needed a way to defend Britain once they were an independent country, and they did this less in terms of culture than ideology, right? So they said that what makes you American is that you believe in republicanism. The were those people who believed in monarchy. So to be American is to believe that the people should govern, and this makes us unique in the world. So that then when you had party conflict in the 1790s between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, the Democratic Republicans would call the Federalists Tories as a way of saying, you don't really believe in the people, right? So this becomes a smear word. And this really holds, I think, into the 20th century. One of the things that helped, I think, change, at least among scholars, their view of the Loyalists is an increasing interest in the late 20th century in the history of Native Americans and African Americans, people of color, because they faced very stark choices about whose side they were going to be on. And we've kind of recovered the importance of the contributions of people of color to the revolution by looking at those Native Americans who did side with the British as the best way of preserving their land claims, or the enslaved African Americans who did run to British lines and even take up arms on their behalf as the best way of attaining their freedom. So this change of interest beyond just what white Americans did has, I think, helped us to have more sympathy for the Loyalist perspective.
Susie, do you have anything you'd want to jump on and add to that as the steward of a Loyalist monument, as it were?
So I would pick up what Eileen mentioned, and that was that the scholars are looking at the Loyalist histories. But in terms of the history that we do at the Shirley-Eustis House, we're kind of taking a different tack, but we haven't been looking so much at the histories that Loyalists wrote, so I had to do a little bit of research on that and the historiography of the Loyalists and how that worked. In preparing for this presentation, it was kind of it was sort of like it's always been in the background for me. So I think that's an interesting take on it, and it'll be interesting to see how it plays out in the future. How these Loyalist histories become more part of the sort of regular knowledge of history fans, I guess.
Well, I think a big part of it, right, is being aware of places like the Shirley-Eustis House and being aware of Loyalist monuments and what happened to those monuments. So I want to pivot to Patrick on this one to start. After the Revolution, monuments were removed and places were renamed. King George's statue, for example, was toppled in New York when the Declaration of Independence was read. And in Massachusetts, Hutchinson, Massachusetts was renamed Bar, Massachusetts, after a British parliamentarian who was perceived as a better friend of the colonies than Hutchinson. So is this setting an American precedent? How can we relate these actions to the removal of statues today? Statues and monuments that the community does not feel represents the stories and heroes we wish to celebrate.
Sure. In the beginning of the war, it wasn't clearly an anti-British phenomena. And then Declaration of Independence, you have this case of these soldiers and sailors dashing down to the equestrian statue of the king in downtown New York City, pulling it down, and not just pulling it down, but they cut off the king's head, and then they fire a musket ball into the head, right? So this is a symbolic regicide, right? This is the closest they can get to executing the king and trying to make a break between our British past and some kind of new American past. And every time that a people kind of collectively agrees, we need to reinvent ourselves, right? We need to reconceive of ourselves as a community. You kind of need those sort of symbolic acts of iconoclasm. So as you mentioned, in the Revolution, there were renamings. King's College becomes Columbia University. You have coats of arms that are pulled down and burned and replaced with new state arms. And it's we can look to this revolutionary experience as a precedent for what's going on today, as Americans kind of rethink their history and accordingly rethink their identity. I think it's necessary for us to not just revise our public memory, but to revise our landscape, which is a way of making our people around us. So it's I would add that George Washington was very upset when the soldiers and sailors pulled down the statue because they did it without approval. And this is kind of one of the big conflicts we have today of, well, if it is okay to remove monuments, on what terms should we do this, right? Is it okay to do what happened, with the soldiers and sailors doing it on their own, pulling it down, or is there a legal process that we need to go through? But I guess if I was saying that the will of the people should subordinate to the rule of law, I'm probably sounding like a Tory at this point, so I should shut up.
Susie, I think you had a story about this that you wanted to.
Yeah. So, I'm speaking to Patrick's comment about the destruction of the equestrian statue of the king. Of course, the American conflict, or the American sort of people, when they were asked about it frequently, were like, well, we love the king, right? We love the king. And of course, Americans still have a love affair with the British monarchy. So as a symbolic piece, that was tremendously upsetting for a lot of people, right? Because they still, even though they'd never met the king and would never meet the king, they still had these warm personal feelings for this father figure, which in British culture had a 1,000-year history of, our king is our father. And that's a hard, no revolution is ever complete, right? You can do these symbolic things and then you draw back. The one that always, in this sort of discussion about the destruction of monuments, the one that always strikes me is the destruction of the monument of the soldier who was the father of Alexandre Dumas in France. And the father of Alexandre Dumas was a Black man born of an enslaved woman in Dominica and a French nobleman. And he was brought to France in the 1700s and educated like a young white Frenchman. He was free because he was on French soil. He rises through the military ranks. He fights in the revolution. He becomes one of Napoleon's most effective and revered generals. But as he rises through the ranks, Napoleon grows to really hate him. And Napoleon is the one who puts him in prison for several years. Fast forward 100 years, there's a statue of him erected. So he's a Black man, but he fights, he fights for the brutality of the Napoleonic armies. The Nazis come through France, they see his statue, and because he's a Black man, they destroy it, right? So there's all these complexities that feed into it. But when we look at statues and monuments, we really only ever see the most simple symbolic stories, right? And when we make these symbols, we always end up removing the complexity from them. And so these symbols are always going to be subject to the reinterpretation of, emotion.
I want to deep dive really into the complexity of the Shirley-Eustis House itself, of which you are the executive director. So it wasn't destroyed as a monument to loyalism, but rather it was appropriated by American troops and later hosted extremely pro-American ceremonies like a celebration for the 1824 return tour of Lafayette, a major event in nationalism and historic memory of the revolution for early Americans. So how do we today evaluate the historical significance of the house itself? Is it a loyalist monument meant to communicate the enduring legacy of loyalists, or a space that's significant because it was reinterpreted and occupied by leading figures in American politics of the 18th century?
So we actually, although we talk about both of those things, we kind of do neither in our interpretation. So what we do is we have developed our story in response to the architecture of the building and to what the building represents. And it is a British country house in America. It's a high Palladian architectural style. It was the type favored by born and bred Brits like Governor Shirley. It was not a colonial country house. And because he was the governor, we interpret the house and the lives of the governor and his family as sort of representations of the British Empire. And we talk about the legacy of the British Empire that the house represents in sort of three ways. One is that, any empire, but in our terms, it's the British Empire, captured, conquered both land and people and exploited them. So we can talk about the slave trade and the British role in the slave trade in the 18th century. We can talk about British imperialism's conquest of natural resources. So you can start with the fur trade in New England and then move to the timber trade. And so there's that sort of piece of imperialism, which later just sort of, both of these things perpetuate through American culture, right? And particularly, or the legacy of these things in America is British. And then the other thing that we can talk about in terms of sort of what the British Empire represents and its imprint on American culture is our sort of persistent problem with wealth inequity, right? Because the British poor laws were very much the imprint for the way we deal with poverty in America today. So on some level, we actually talk about the continuities there. And I'll give you just one quick example, because I realized that was sort of a pretty abstract description before. But for example, Governor Shirley, the royal governor in the 1740s, was referred to as Your Excellency, right? We would never call a governor that today in America. Ditto for Governor Eustis, the Democratic Republican governor of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts after the Revolutionary War. As late as 1825, Massachusetts governor is still being called Your Excellency. What that represents is this continuity of British identity, culture, food, politics, religion, literature that persists in America for many years, as we try to find this, new national identity. And so those other three subjects that I talked about before, they're part and parcel of any empire, but in America, they have a particularly British origin story.
That is
so that's how we talk about the Shirley-Eustis House. So the Loyalists and Patriot only kind of swim through that larger current.
I just want to jump in. We had some questions in the chat that are it's a great discussion about the Lion and the Unicorn being taken down. I did not know this, but they were evidently also taken down in the Pennsylvania State House. But to my first Susan L, asking if they were removed from the old State House in Boston, they were removed. However, they were put back in, I believe, the 1870s, I have been told, to get the building to its original state. However, there was public backlash at the time. So when they reinstalled the Lion and the Unicorn at the old State House in Boston, they also installed an eagle as well. So that tension is there in our space as well. So and I believe they were replaced. I want to say the 1870s, but don't hold me to it. What you should do is come into our space and take a tour, and our brilliant interpretation team will take you through and point it out to you. I do want to deep dive a little more into the monuments, just in general. And Patrick, I think I want to pass this to you first. Why were some monuments and properties or artifacts decimated and others reappropriated generally?
A lot of the reasons for iconoclasm was symbolic, to show that shift in allegiance and that change of regime. This is one of the reasons why that the statue of the king was taken down in New York, but there are also practical calculations. I mean, the Shirley House was useful to the American Army. The William Vassall House in Cambridge, became a command center for the Continental Army when it was located in Cambridge during the siege of Boston. One of the reasons why the New York monument was taken down wasn't just, we want to have this proxy murder of the king, execution of the king, but it's 4,000 pounds of lead in the hands of an army that was absolutely starved for ammunition. Took it to a foundry and melted it down to 42,000 musket balls, and then fired, as they put it, melted majesty back at the British Army. So a lot of these questions of what aspects of the old British regime were preserved and what were torn down had to some degree to do with symbolic cultural considerations, but also practical calculations. And I agree with Susie that Americans typically hold on to British culture, but they readapt it, just like with the Shirley House. We were singing God Save the King. Now we just keep the tune and we sing My Country 'Tis of Thee, right? Same melody. And there are, speaking of restoring the Lion and the Unicorn, there's some proposals with that empty pedestal in New York to replace the King statue as a form of historic restoration, and that does not go over. So there's limits to, I think, how much Americans are willing to hold on to their material British heritage as part of historic memory, but practical as well as symbolic considerations come into play.
Susie, do you have anything that you'd like to add on to that?
Well, with respect to preservation, right? So in terms of these historic houses, and the Longfellow House is one, and the Loring Grinnell House is another, with these Isaac Royal House and slave quarters, all Loyalist houses that were preserved because people generally said, you know, well, he's not there anymore, but it's a nice house. I'd like that house, right? And in the Shirley house, for example, when the entire neighborhood was sort of destroyed at one point, the house itself is made of such heavy timbers. It's so stoutly built that it was more expensive to, you know, sort of tear it down than it was to actually just pick it up and move it across the street at one point, because it was a nice house, right? And so at some point, it doesn't really matter that it was a Loyalist house, and in fact, it becomes sort of a curiosity.
Eileen, I'm gonna pop this one over to you. Did historians preserve and erase Loyalists in the same way monuments and material culture did?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really interesting comparison. And yeah, I mean, I think especially when you look at what I was saying about how these early American nationalist historians were copying and plagiarizing from Loyalist historians and then converting what they were taking from these Loyalist historians into a nationalist message. I think it is very similar to what Americans were doing with places like the Shirley House. In a way, you could say these American nationalist historians were occupying the words of the Loyalist historians in the way that Americans were occupying these houses. And again, and similar to, I think, both what Patrick and Susie were saying, the fact that they are so dependent on these Loyalist texts to construct their nationalist message shows that persisting influence and connection to Britain, and the way they're readapting that connection to serve to create a distinctive sense of American identity.
Susie, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Well, I think just one of the things is that as we go forward, as you know, for me, a public historian, and for Patrick and Eileen as scholars, what's really exciting is this setting aside the black and the white and the good guy and the bad guy, and just looking at the continuities that help us define who we are as a people. Because I think that's what most people who visit the Shirley-Eustis House come away with, is a sense that their history that they've enriched their knowledge of their identity, their historical identity as an American, right? And what that means. So it becomes a subtler story than good guys, bad guys, black and white.
Question in the chat that we're getting for people who want to, you know, experience a monument to the Loyalists. What other Loyalist houses besides the Longfellow House are open today? Catherine K has asked.
So I would say the Royal House and Slave Quarters in Medford is just an amazing site. And again, the Loring Greenough House in Jamaica Plain is a good one. And I can't think of any others at the moment, but there's they can reach out to me, because there actually is we have a brochure that sort of talks about the Tory Trail. And so you can visit a bunch of Tory houses in New England. And I can actually send a copy of that to whoever wants to reach out to me at the Shirley-Eustis House.
It's telling that we're strained to think of any Loyalist landmarks, right? And this is the issue that we're talking about. I would maybe suggest like Fort Ticonderoga, which, like the Shirley House, was a British site that is readapted as an American site, and the curatorial staff there is really dedicated to telling the story of the British Army and not just the Americans who occupied it and turned it around, and the role of the French and the Native Americans as well. So there are curators out there that are trying to recover those lost Loyalist stories that are kind of buried under our longstanding patriot boosterism.
Also, Susan L has suggested King's Chapel still has a place for the royal governor to sit, and Marl Pit Hall in Middletown, New Jersey, in Monmouth County, was also a chat suggestion too. Thank you, our chat participants. I want to zoom back out and bring us kind of now into where we stand today. So rather than thinking of the Loyalists as, I think, you learned in elementary school, here were the good guys, it was the revolutionaries, and here was the bad guys, it was the Loyalists, rather than thinking of them as villains in the story of how America came to be, how might we present them in a fairer and more nuanced way to students and the general public?
I guess what I would say is that I would say one way to do that is to acknowledge that, like the revolutionaries, the Loyalists were Americans too. And to make people recognize that, you know, the revolution is not just a war of independence by Americans against the British, but that it's also a civil war between Americans, and between Americans who shared many of the same values.
Patrick, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would say that insofar as there's a tradition in America of conscientious objection and resistance to the draft, that people who hold those views in America today and in recent history can look to people like the Quakers and the Mennonites who were in a really terrible position of their religious convictions preventing them from being a part of this cause. And in terms of those Loyalists who were, you know, held Whig principles and sided with the crown, I'd say that what they were saying was that there needed to be the rule of law often requires some check on majority will, and this remains part of the American tradition. It becomes integral to the U.S. Constitution and is central to our politics this day. And if we just kind of step back and say, oh, wait a minute, you know what? The Loyalists never went away, right? The Loyalist tradition is really central to the American tradition. Then I think we'll understand the Loyalists of the Revolutionary era in a different light.
Susie, do you have anything to round us out on that idea?
Well, yes, I would say definitely visit the homes of the Loyalists because you'll be not only sort of learning that history kind of upfront and, you know, environmentally, but you'll be supporting some really wonderful institutions that are doing a lot of work to preserve our local and national history and to preserve our story in all its complexity.
I'm going to pull a fantastic question out of the chat. I love this. It's Benjamin A. says, where does the study of loyalism go from here? What, if possible, new avenues would you like to see the study of loyalism go down?
There's been some really good recent research on the so-called ordinary people who become Loyalists. I mean, the Thomas Hutchinsons or William Franklin's are well known, but as historians become more appreciative of the role of ordinary people, so-called in history, I think there's more attention on those common folks who didn't. There was an earlier kind of narrative that the Loyalists were the aristocrats. They were the big landholders. They were the rich merchants, and this was kind of a class war, right? And they were driven out. Score one for the common man, but there were plenty of common people who remained Loyalists and suffered terribly, and as a result of that, and their stories I think are being told, but need to be told more, and particularly in the case of African Americans and Native Americans who have less documented lives.
Susie, I saw you had something to add to that as well.
Oh, I think it would be interesting too. I was sort of Patrick sort of took the wind out of my sail, I guess. But I think it's been interesting as I sort of continue to read in this area also is to look at, and this isn't looking at the Loyalists exactly, but the British sailors and soldiers were essentially considered, expendable people, right? And they were frequently, there are a lot of complaints, not only from Americans in the sort of being occupied, but also from the British gentry about how rough the British the soldiers are, right? And how they're just destructive. They're because they're paid very, very poorly. The Navy and the British, sort of generals, they really are considered expendable people. And so I think that's something that hasn't been sort of cut out, I think, a lot and talked about in a sort of bigger picture of the Revolutionary War and what these men thought, and how they experienced it.
That's fascinating.
They're there to fight on behalf of the king, but mostly they don't care. They just want to eat.
Right.
So, yeah.
Right. Well, going on what you just said that you've been reading up, as you've encountered in your reading, We got another question from Alan W. in the chat. What books would our panelists recommend if somebody wants to read more about Loyalist history?
Liberty's Exiles by Maya Johnston, which I think I saw pop up in the chat. Some older literature like Bernard Bailyn's Ordeal of Thomas Hutchinson or William Allen Benton's Whig Loyalists has helped to frame my understanding of loyalism as a graduate student. But there's a lot of good new literature, and I would suggest reading Eileen's book too. Put in a plug for yourself there, Eileen.
Also, one book that's a relatively new book, and I think this ties in also to this issue of kind of new directions with loyalists. Something that we haven't talked much about is the issue of women loyalists. There is one new book by Casey Tillman about women loyalists, but I think that's an area where much more could be done, because I think, being a woman at that time, women, married women at the time were not given any kind of political rights or political identity of their own. So I think that gets us into all kinds of interesting questions as to what does it mean for a woman to be a loyalist, or can a woman even be a loyalist if she's not being allowed political choices? So I think that's something that could be worthy of more study, and I think that book by Casey Tillman addresses some of these issues.
Shannon Potter also wrote on loyalist women, but I may be mistaken about that. Shannon Potter.
Oh yes, right. Yes, you're right.
Eileen, your book is the one that Patrick is referring to, the Plain and Noble Garb of Truth, or do you have another one that's coming out?
Well, yeah, that book doesn't. I mean, I talk in one chapter about the Loyalists. Yeah, it's really, I think the one that I'm working on is the one that's more focused on the Loyalists, but it's not done yet. So, well,
as soon as it's done and we get that info, we will send it out to folks if they're interested. Gosh, you guys in the chat, you are giving us such amazing questions. And I think this is just, it might be a hard one to answer. And I know we only have a few hot seconds before I have my last question for our panelists, but Alan W, coming back at you with a great one. This is the doozy. What do you think the psychological effect was on the Loyalists from being banished to the colonies? Does anybody have a thought about that, what that narrative would look like?
I don't think that there is a single narrative, which is why I think it's hard to answer. I think the Loyalists really varied in terms of how they dealt with being banished. So, for example, you mentioned Thomas Hutchinson. I think he really suffered. He was never really happy in England. He always wanted to go home. He spent all his time trying to justify what he did, and so I think it did have a really a detrimental psychological effect on him to be banished like that, because he felt like he had lost his home. But I think Maya Jasanoff's book that was mentioned, she talks a lot about how a lot of these Loyalists are quite resilient and find ways to adapt to being exiled and find new lives, and actually take some of the ideas that we consider American and take them into these other areas and spread them to the rest of the British Empire.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that there were a lot of the Loyalists who relocated from, say, New York and New Jersey to Canada took enormous pride in themselves as being, we're the ones who remain true. We kept our oaths. And to this day, there are a lot of people in Ontario who pride themselves for being the descendants of United Empire Loyalists. It's actually, I think, a big part of Anglo-Canadian identity. We were the North Americans who weren't jerks, right? Is I think kind of how they see it. And from other people, from the perspective of other people, like for instance, enslaved people, the removal from what becomes the United States is not necessarily a trauma. It's in many cases it's literal liberation, physical and spiritual liberation, and the chance to start a new life. Not to say that it's going to be easy for them. It won't.
I want to round us out on our closing question, because it's a big one. What about the Loyalists haven't we talked about that people should know?
That so many of them just, I think, as I said at the beginning, kind of melted into the woodwork, right? They didn't have the wherewithal to speak out in their little communities. A lot of them, for example, the minister in Hingham in that time, very well respected man, was able to sort of toe the line, right, between his parishioners who were patriots and those who were Loyalists. And because he was such a respected man in the community, he was left alone. And I think that story, community bonds sometimes overrode the larger political considerations. And so, that history gets lost, I think.
Well, I guess what I would say, and we've sort of alluded to this, but I guess I would want to put more emphasis on this, is just the way that the Loyalists were treated. We've talked about, they were exiled, their property was confiscated, but in fact, they were mistreated in all kinds of much more severe ways. I mean, they were tarred and feathered, they were tortured in all kinds of cruel ways. And I think it's important to bear that in mind, because I think to understand more about the Loyalists is to understand more about the revolutionaries and to see some of the limitations of the revolutionaries. And I think that's another reason why it's important to recover the story of the Loyalists.
Yeah, I would just have to agree with Susie and Eileen. Susie alluded to Ebenezer Gay and Hingham, and he was one of the few who managed to negotiate this conflict. But there were, for instance, clergymen who were terribly mistreated and lost everything, and were faced with beatings or torture, and they absolutely refused to give in. And as Americans in a republic, we see them as the bad guys, but they're stories of extraordinary moral courage that I think need to be told. And as kind of symbols of dissent, when sometimes the majority is wrong, maybe we should recover those stories and tell them, and even see them in curious ways, American heroes.
Well, just recently reading Mark Peterson's book, The City-State of Boston, and he actually starts to reformulate a little bit to push back on some of the histories of some of the patriots. So Sam Adams in his book comes out as really kind of a thug, and he arranges for sort of some of these awful things to happen to some loyalists. So, it's kind of give and take.
We are at the end of our time today, and there is still so much more to talk about. Thank you guys so much, and I hope to see you back here soon. Thank you, everyone.